Mic check 1 2. Mic check. For you. Mic check 1 2. Speaking into a microphone. So if you spin the volume knob up, and then if you turn that towards you, it'll keep turning up the volume to a level that's more comfortable. So is it getting louder or quieter? I can mic check 1 2 3 4. Test 1 2. Mic check 1 2 3 4. That's good.
Thank you. Test.
Hey everyone, I think we're going to start momentarily. The last vote just closed, so we're just going to wait for some members to show up. But we'll be going soon. Sorry.
The Committee on Veterans Affairs was established to ensure that the government is held accountable to that promise. And as I've said before, and I'm going to say this every time I chair one of these meetings, this is not a bipartisan committee. This is a nonpartisan committee. And I do truly appreciate all the members, my colleagues from both sides of the aisle, for honoring that. It is remarkable, and I appreciate it greatly. Congress must be diligent in our efforts to continuously explore ways to improve the lives of veterans. Through our oversight of the federal agencies that were established to benefit veterans and their families and developing legislation that improves these benefits, we seek to honor the commitment we have made to those who have served our country. Today we're meeting to listen to the perspective of the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Labor. We'll also hear the views of numerous organizations that exist to assist veterans, service members, and military families. We are interested in their perspective on legislative proposals that have been introduced to improve their experiences with the federal government programs that were designed to benefit them. I've introduced a bill that will help service members connect with veteran service organizations as they move through their transition assistance program at the Department of Defense. The TAP program is a well-intended program that is supposed to ensure that service members have resources as they transition out of military life. However, as the hearing we had just a month ago revealed, there are many missing links in the TAP process, and it often misses the mark. TAP needs to be much more focused on ensuring that a service member leaves the military with a plan in place for work, housing, and for social engagement. We continue to explore ways to improve this TAP program in Congress, but my bill will take a step in the right direction by connecting service members with a community that is there to assist them after transition. As we work to improve the transition program, we also recognize that many veterans do not have a sufficient safety net after their transition to civilian life and may fall into homelessness. While the number of homeless veterans has decreased over the last few years, it is still essential that we provide services to support these veterans in a fiscally responsible way. Today, we will hear testimony on legislation that seeks to improve the housing and support services offered to veterans. We'll also hear testimony on bills that are intended to provide employment protections for reservists and members of the National Guard that are called upon to deploy and their families. One bill seeks to make service members whole if they need to take their cases to court. We'll also hear comments on a few bills that were introduced to improve the education benefits that are available to veterans. While all of these bills are well-intended, as always, the devil is in the detail. And I'll look forward to hearing the thoughtful perspectives of the witnesses on these proposals here today. I now yield to the ranking member for his opening comments.
Well, thank you so much, Chairman Van Orden, for holding this legislative hearing, and thank you for your leadership of this subcommittee. Thank you to everybody for being here, and I appreciate your working with us as we have the congressional baseball game this evening. I hope many of you will be out there. And I was asked in the elevator, am I on Team Red or Team Blue? I said I'm on Team Red, White, and Blue. So this is a great event tonight. The best way we can show veterans that we take our work seriously in Congress is by advancing policy that provides them with the benefits and the services they have earned. I'd like to highlight a few of the bills on the agenda that deliver on that promise. First, I'd like to thank Representative McGarvey for introducing the Veterans Education Oversight Expansion Act. I proudly sponsored the Isakson-Roe Healthcare and Benefits Improvement Act, and while it has been a great boon for veteran education oversight and quality, there's always more work to do. Representative McGarvey's legislation, which I serve as a co-lead on, makes some common sense improvements to the law, including benefit restoration, school oversight, and implementation of the law. Next, Representative DeLuzio, another baseball player, these are all by baseball players, has offered the Job Security for Military Families Act. The very first hearing this subcommittee held this year was on USERRA protections, and we heard repeatedly about the need to strengthen employment protections for service members and their families. Our military is in a recruitment crisis, and we need to remove barriers for individuals who choose military service. Military spouse unemployment is 3 times the civilian rate. That's a stunning statistic. And the number one reason individuals leave the military is because of how it impacts their family. Representative DeLuzio's bill provides new job protections for military spouses, making it easier for service members to stay part of the world's greatest military. Finally, as we've discussed on multiple occasions in this subcommittee, I remain deeply concerned about the effects of last month's expiration of pandemic-era flexibilities and funding on our ability to end and prevent veteran homelessness. On May 11th, the maximum rate at which a grant in per diem, or GPD, provider can be reimbursed for providing transitional housing and services to veterans experiencing homelessness decreased from 300% of the state home domiciliary rate to 115% overnight. That's huge. These percentages can get confusing, so I'm going to talk about these numbers in dollars and cents for just a second. The maximum per diem rate went from over $150 to just $64 a day. That happened literally overnight. I'm pleased that we're considering H.R. 491 today, which I'm proud to co-sponsor, which would raise the maximum per diem rate to 200% of the state home rate, which is $112. We're also considering a Republican proposal that would raise the maximum per diem rate to 133% of the state home rate, or $74, with potential waivers for 10% of providers up to that $112 a day level. There's clearly a significant difference between these two proposals that needs to be addressed. So I hope the chairman shares my commitment to continuing to work together to find a per diem rate that we can all agree meets the needs of providers and the veterans in their care. So thank you again to my friend Chairman Van Orden for considering these bills, and I hope we can find a way to advance them all to the full committee as quickly as possible. And I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Levin. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Takano.
Thank you, Chairman Van Orden. Today, this subcommittee is considering two bills, Congresswoman Nikema Williams' H.R. 491, the Return Home to Housing Act, and Congresswoman Chavez de Remmer's H.R. 3848, the Home Act of 2023. I'm bothered by the delay in getting here today, as it is now been over a month since the emergency authorities for homeless veterans expired. Because we have lost time and ground in our fight to end homelessness, for me, the key consideration of any bill is going to be this. Does the bill do the maximum amount to help homeless veterans get off the street and into permanent housing? On May 11th, the maximum rate at which VA GPD providers can be reimbursed for the cost of caring for homeless veterans dropped from over $150 a day to a mere $64 a day. We are already hearing about the stress this is putting on providers. Many are faced with choosing between paying for security or staff and reducing the number of beds they can keep open for homeless veterans. Now, some providers are leaving the grant and per diem program entirely due to this financial strain. Congresswoman Nikema Williams' bill would raise the maximum per diem rate to $112 a day. Congresswoman Chavez de Remmer's bill raises the maximum per diem rate to $74 a day. There is a large delta between these two numbers, $38 a day per veteran served. And that $38 matters to providers and veterans. With that additional funding, providers can afford to keep clinical staff that can provide the treatment and services these veterans need. They can continue to operate training programs so that unhoused veterans can gain skills and opportunities to get back on their feet. We received a number of statements for the record from grant and per diem providers. One indicated that failure to raise the per diem rate will result in over $1 million budget shortfall for their facility this year. Another reported that they will have a $60,000 a month shortfall. That's a month shortfall at the current per diem rate. I believe this is unacceptable considering the tremendous responsibility we place on these providers to care for our most vulnerable. The chairman, ranking member, and our staffs should work together with our Senate counterparts to quickly find a solution that adequately supports transitional housing providers and gives them more predictability with their funding. Now, I want to turn to another provision in H.R. 3848. I'm deeply concerned about the language that amends the West Los Angeles Leasing Act of 2016, and it's unclear to me why this is being considered alongside provisions related to ending veteran homelessness. The language proposed here is counter to what we intended in passing the law in 2016. I was there, I know. Everything done at the West LA must be focused on benefiting veterans. Veterans need more housing, they need more services, and we must not impede the oversight necessary to continue the process of getting West LA away from its long and difficult history and continue it on the right path in service to veterans. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back. Thank you for the courtesy.
Absolutely. I will now introduce our witness panel. Our first witness, Mr. Joseph Garcia, the Executive Director of Education Services at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Mr. Garcia is accompanied by Ms. Melissa Cohen, Deputy Executive Director of Outreach, Transition, and Economic Development, and Ms. Monica Diaz, the Executive Director, Office of Homeless Programs at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Our second witness is the former Marine, Mr. James Rodriguez, the Assistant Secretary for Veterans Employment and Training Services at the Department of Labor. Mr. Rodriguez is accompanied by Mr. Paul Marone, the USERRA Policy Chief for Veterans Employment and Training Services at the Department of Labor. I ask your witnesses to please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to provide is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you very much. Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Please sit down. Hey, before we get rolling here, this is really painful for me to say this, but I'd like to wish the Army happy birthday today. So, happy birthday, guys. I'm going to say this one time, okay? One time only. Hua. There you go. We could, yes, we could. Hey, in the interest of time, and because I know that there's several members that have some previous commitments, I ask unanimous consent to waive the taking of oral testimony and proceed directly to questioning of the witnesses. All witnesses' written statements will, of course, be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. We're now going to proceed with questioning, and I'm not going to ask members to please respect the 5-minute rule. I'm going to tell you that's how much time you got to talk, me included, so the clock is running. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want you to know that I read your testimony in detail. I read every single line of every word when it comes to these panels, so I do not want you to think that I have not taken this incredibly seriously. And I take detail, ask my staff, it's detailed notes, then I get with this staff, which is excellent. And so this is an incredibly important thing, what we're dealing with here. I want you to understand that. Ms. Diaz, the VA expects to increase the grant per diem rate. They estimated it would cost $1.56 billion over 5 years and $3.31 billion over 10 years. This would be an increase of $38 million for FY 2024 and approximately $272 million over 5 years and approximately $737 million over 10 years. The VA also indicates that it's awarding fewer beds based on needs expressed by the community. Can you please explain to me why the VA needs more money for the program if the number of beds needed has decreased?
Thank you for the question. When we did the estimations for budget, when it comes to the numbers that you mentioned, we actually averaged those not on bed capacity, but on the average occupancy rate, which is 77% of what we're seeing. For any increase in per diem rate, we will need an increase based on our budget because there is an increase. The tabulation of the numbers that you got was based on the 200% number, based on that 77 average occupancy rate. So we're not using capacity, right, in terms of all the beds that we have, and the total amount for that, it ended up being those totals.
Okay, let's maybe figure out a better way to express that, because it seems like we're giving more money and getting less bang for the buck. And obviously, this is my ranking member's number one priority is veterans' homelessness. So that's the end state is every veteran that would like to be housed should be housed. Mr. Rodriguez, thank you very much for bringing your staff by my office. I appreciated that meeting. It was fantastic. And in your previous testimony before the committee, you've indicated that you expect 1 million spouses to be eligible for USERRA if the law were expanded to include military spouses. How do you, I have a couple things. How do you collect the data on military spouse employment? And we're going to keep this staccato answers, please. How do you, first of all, collect the data? then how did you arrive on that estimate of 1 million persons?
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you again for meeting with us. We had a great conversation about the protection for military spouses. We have various sources of data, and one of the things is we know that the data, though, I would admit, is not 100% accurate. And one of the reasons being is because a lot of military spouses don't self-identify. And so through a few of the surveys that—
I get it. Again, I'm just, for brevity's sake, because I want two answers, not one. So you use a bunch of different variables. What's your figure of merit, meaning how accurate do you think that 1 million is?
I think it's pretty accurate.
Okay. All right, now, do you, because we talked about this, do you see the potential of abuse of this program? And let's remember, I've been married to a Navy wife for 30 years, so my respect for our Navy spouses is more than I can express in this period of time. So I want to make sure we do them right. I just want you to be able to articulate whether or not you believe that there is potential for waste, fraud, and abuse in this program if we extend USERRA protections to spouses.
So if I could say one more thing, out of those 1 million, right now we anticipate only 568,000 who are actually in the labor force would even be eligible for USERRA protections.
Okay.
But based off of the 1 million veterans who are, 1 million service members who are Guard, Reserve, active duty, we only get about 1,000 cases a year. So if you
Okay.
take that number,
I gotcha.
Right.
What about the potential for waste, fraud, and abuse in this program?
I do not believe military spouses would take advantage of a system that's there to support them wholeheartedly. I believe that they actually want to work. I think they are looking for opportunities to work. I think they're looking for opportunities to keep their jobs so they can support their families. I think that is a misrepresentation of the military spouses,
I'm asking.
honestly.
And do you think that the United States government should be reaching into private industry when it comes to a spouse and not a direct service member who has signed a contract with the United States government?
I would be the first one to say I think military spouses serve alongside their
Hey,
veterans,
dude,
right?
listen,
So
30 years, pal. You don't
I
have
got
to tell
that.
me anything. I'm asking you a real specific question.
I think it's important for us as a federal government to help work with our private industries to get them to understand why spouses' retention and employment is so valuable to the service of the individual.
All right, and with that, my time has expired. Oh, in accordance with Committee Rule 5, Echo, I ask unanimous consent that Representative Rosendale be permitted to participate in today's subcommittee hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I now yield to my ranking member, Mr. Levin, for 5 minutes.
Thank my friend, the chairman, and I thank all of you for all the work you're doing for our veterans. Ms. Diaz, when we think about the GPD program, we often equate it solely with transitional housing. In reality, GPD providers do much more than just give veterans a safe place to sleep. Can you please speak to the treatment and services that GPD providers deliver to veterans in transitional housing?
Thank you for that question. Definitely, GPD providers provide the transitional housing, as you mentioned. But besides that, we provide the comprehensive supportive services, which cost and funding, right, to provide. That includes case management. The frequency of that case management sometimes is geared to substance use disorders treatment, to mental health treatment. We also provide housing navigation services to help the veteran find housing placement. That includes as well services such as job training, financial management and training, and much more. So there is very intentional supported services to make sure that the program is successful and the services that the veteran is receiving as well provide the sustainability of the housing.
As I said in my opening, I'm very interested in coming to an agreement on a per diem rate that adequately reimburses providers for the cost of shelter and care for those veterans who are most vulnerable. How long has VA been hearing from providers that the per diem rate is too low?
We have been hearing this for a while, years, I would say, but more recently, within the last decade, I've been on the program myself for 5 years, and I've been hearing this myself directly for 5 years.
And did any providers drop out of the GPD program in anticipation of the public health emergency ending and the rate reverting to $64 a day?
We have heard of some providers letting us know that they decided to not reapply because of the GPD rate being low to meet the operational costs and services. Granted, I would like to add that they're not required to tell us, so there might be other stories that we haven't heard about it.
And how does the lower per diem rate affect a provider's ability to adequately staff and secure their facility?
It impacts them significantly because based on having reliable funding, then you can plan, right? You can plan on the staffing that you need, the services that you can provide, and provide the needs that that community and that veteran needs. Without having that, then you have to compromise those services. And when you compromise the services, then you compromise the care and the outcomes.
Very good. Mr. Rodriguez, I'll turn to you. Good to see you again. This isn't related to a bill before us, but I want to take just a quick opportunity to ask you while you're here. The budget agreement recently passed into law, which was a result of brinksmanship, I think you could say, regarding our nation's ability to pay its bills and protected VA from many cuts. However, other agencies that provide services for veterans, like, for example, DOL vets, were not spared from these cuts. Can you briefly describe some of the cuts to veteran services you're expecting because of the debt limit agreement?
Congressman, it's always great to see you, and thank you for that question. One of the most important challenges we're going to have is cuts to our personnel. So the reduction of our personnel is one of the most important things to me because of the fact I need personnel to execute programs, to have oversight of programs, to ensure we are eliminating risk in the execution of our programs. So that's the first and foremost, the most important thing that is going to be affected by cuts. But also the ability to not fund specific grants, like the Homeless Veteran Reintegration Program, not having the ability to fund grantees who can actually be providing those services to our veterans who are experiencing homelessness. The ability to not have oversight of our USERRA programs. For example, we look to expand that program. We need additional investigators to go out and be able to support someone who is submitting a claim. Being able to not have up-to-date administrative systems to capture all the data, to capture all the information we need to make a well-founded decision in the claims process. We need, and I could go on, but those are some of the highlights.
So I think it's important that as we talk about the ongoing appropriations and getting to an agreement, as we've said, through the whole debt limit situation, that we weren't going to have any cuts to veterans. I was really pleased to see that we didn't have any cuts to VA. However, the other, whether it's DOL vets, whether it's HUD-VASH, the other programs that veterans rely on, veterans who are at risk rely on, are very much at risk of being cut if we don't stand up as the House Veterans Affairs Committee across the aisle as well and say no cuts to veterans really means no cuts to veterans, whether that's directly VA programs or whether it's HUD programs or whether it's DOL programs. So I hope we all can get with our respective sides and make sure that happens in the coming months. So with that, I will yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Levin. I now recognize Mr. Crane from Arizona, my friend, for 5 minutes.
Thank you all for coming. At this time, I have no questions.
Thank you, Mr. Crane. I now recognize Ranking Member of the full committee, Mr. Takano, for 5 minutes. After he sits down, just wait a minute. All right. You got it?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a few questions for Ms. Diaz. Ms. Diaz, the VA's testimony states that Representative Williams' bill, H.R. 491, is a more cost-effective approach to grant and per diem. Why is that?
When we're looking, thank you for the question, when we're looking at the 200% and looking at cost effectiveness, the reason why we stated that was that a lot of our providers did not request it. We saw this through the last 3 years, did not request the higher per diem rate during that time. So what we foresee is that if we go to a lower per diem rate, a lot of the providers will go to the cap of that lower per diem rate because they need more of that resource. When we're looking at the 200% in itself, and we look at the utilization of those and how many grantees utilize that, it was an average, depending on the time of the data obtained, it was an average of 70 grantees, programs requesting that. So we foresee that looking into a rate that really meets the needs of those grantees will be more cost effective because not all of them will go into the cap of that per diem rate. The other piece that we found that it to be cost effective is the fact that it meets the needs of our veterans. It allows us the flexibility to be able to utilize the per diem rate to meet all veterans' need, not some, by having the flexibility to utilize, onto that cap in itself.
So does the provision in HR 3848 amending the West LA Leasing Act do anything to end veteran homelessness in the West LA region?
In that particular section of the bill, we did recognize a position in favor for that, but we also recognize that it doesn't have a big impact when it comes to homeless programs and operations. So our position as well is that regardless that there is a favorable position to move forward, we don't see a big impact when it comes to the homeless programs at this immediate moment or operations.
So do veterans in the Los Angeles area support this proposal?
Thank you for that question. There has been veterans in the areas that had voiced that they are not in favor necessarily with that position. We also acknowledge that we haven't heard all veterans' voices, and we honor all veterans' voices, right? So there might be veterans that are in support, or others that maybe are in a neutral state of that approach. That said, I do want to affirm again that even though our position is to support it, and we're grateful for that, we also recognize that this doesn't have a bigger impact when it comes to homeless programs and services. So we are happy to look at this separate from the bill if that is necessary.
All right, well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Takano. I now recognize Mr. Rosendale for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Van Orden, for holding this hearing and allowing me to participate in it today. I do appreciate that. My bill, the Veterans Education Assistance Improvement Act, H.R. 3877, cuts red tape for student veterans when receiving their benefits. My bill will make the VA's decisions that could be harmful to student veterans less likely to occur going forward. My bill would also allow Congress to be proactive instead of reactive by being able to solve potential problems before veterans are negatively impacted. Under the current law, veterans are required to take a full course load to receive their military housing allowance, regardless of how many classes are actually needed to graduate. This places an unnecessary burden on the veterans by requiring them to take on additional classes that are not necessary for their degree. It also costs the taxpayers more money. My legislation would remove this provision and provide veterans the choice of how many classes they wish to take in their last semesters. Veterans should be able to make the best decisions for themselves and for their families. Moreover, my legislation would require the VA to notify Congress, educational institutions, and students of any rule changes not subject to the Congressional Review Act that would impact the student veterans 180 days in advance. For example, in 2021, VA officials updated a series of definitions surrounding the 8515 rule. Many schools expressed alarm how the new guidance would make it more difficult to accept student veterans and their beneficiaries. I heard from schools across the nation about this 8515 rule and had to make many personal calls to the Veterans Administration and to the educational institutions to help try and sort these things out. Without a fix, there was a fear that these educational institutions would shut down and student veterans would be left without any good options to continue their education, or they were just being told that they weren't going to be able to resume those classes again. I worked in a bipartisan fashion to fix this problem. My legislation would stop future problems before they become full-blown crisis for the student veterans by requiring sufficient notice to allow stakeholders adequate time to weigh in. Section 1015 of the Veterans Healthcare and Benefits Improvement Act of 2020 requires an institution receiving VA funding to either be approved and participate in at least one program under Title IX or receive a waiver from this requirement each year. This disproportionately impacted religious institutions by making them apply for a waiver each year without a guarantee for more than 1 year, reducing administrative burdens for religious institutions. It should not be more difficult for religious educational institutions than secular ones to serve veterans and their families. First established in 1944, the GI Bill has resulted in millions qualifying veterans and their families receiving money to cover some or all cost of school training. We owe it to our veterans to have an education system that is easy to use and understand and works for them. My legislation cuts red tape and moves our country closer towards showing veterans the compassion and respect that they deserve. I hope that the administration and all of my colleagues can support this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. Before I dismiss the panel, I'd like to remind all persons present that Congress sets a top-line budget, and then the departments dictate policy. So if DOL vets, meaning you, Mr. Rodriguez, decide to put bureaucrats and fund them over homeless veterans, that will be your choice. And I will be pulling you up here to this committee, and you will explain to the American public why you made the intentional choice to fund bureaucrats as opposed to homeless veterans. Is that crystal clear, Mr. Rodriguez?
Mr. Chairman, I tell you, they're not bureaucrats, they're actual government employees who are working.
Is that crystal clear, Mr.
veterans.
Rodriguez? I asked you yes or no.
That's
question.
clear.
Very well. Thank you very much. The witnesses are now excused. I hope you'll stick around for the second panel. On our second panel, we'll hear from the following witnesses. Mr. Patrick Murray, Director of National Legislative Service for Veterans of Foreign Wars, sorry. Okay. And Mr. Ricardo Gomez, Employment and Education Policy Advocate for the American Legion. Sorry about that. Mr. Matthew Schwartzman, the Director of Legislation and Military Policy at the Reserve Organization of America, and Ms. Meredith M. Smith, the Government Relations Deputy Director for the National Military Family Association. And Mr. Kevin Hollinger, Legislative Director for the Enlisted Association of the National Guard of the United States. Happy birthday, by the way. I'd like to welcome you guys. You're here at the witness table. Please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to provide is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you very much. Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. We will now proceed directly to questions. And I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Smith, You stated in your testimony that expanding USERRA to military spouses would have unexpected consequences to the workforce. What do you think these unexpected consequences would be?
Thank you for the question. One of the questions that we have about the version of the legislation that we have seen is what is defined as military necessity or a reason to take time away from work. And so without understanding kind of the details of that particular provision, we have questions about what the impact to the workforce would be.
Okay. And I do, honestly, I do have deep reservations about this because I really don't think it's the United States government's place to exercise these mandates on companies when the person that's involved didn't sign the contract. I mean, we all sign contracts with the government, and the USERRA protections have got to be ironclad. We can never muck about with that. And I know we've been, and Mr. Takano's been working really hard to make sure that these USERRA protections, and I agree with him completely, need to be ironclad, but I do have reservations about this. Do you think that there's a chance that this proposed legislation could backfire and remove years of progress that we have made in Congress that we've talked about in reducing military spouse unemployment?
So I don't know if backfire is exactly what I would...
Unintended consequences.
We are concerned about unintended consequences. I mean, we think that the spirit of the legislation is good to ensure that military spouses are able to find and maintain employment. We have questions about whether or not USERRA is the appropriate tool to ensure that that is a reality for military families.
Okay. I used to be on the board of directors for a thing called the Rosie Network. It was started by Stephanie Brown. She's the widow of a retired Navy SEAL named Tom Brown. Admiral Brown is a friend of mine. Unfortunately, he's dead now. But and that what she does is she helps military spouses, both men and women, start their own companies that they can travel with, essentially. And that's a really good solution. But it's not for everybody. So let's see if we can get this right to make sure that we have the most highly educated and highly unemployed demographic in the country. So if we can do something, I'm more than happy to do that. I just want to make sure that we get it correct. Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Murray from the VFW. Under TAP Promotion Act, what would VFW talk about during their 1-hour TAP curriculum? How would the VFW ensure that there would be no recruiting of transitioning service members from those teaching the class?
So what we really see the role of accredited representatives, veteran service officers, as a key tool in the whole TAP toolbox. What we want to be is a complementary asset for the VA benefits briefings. Accredited representatives can sign you up for your benefits right there on the spot. VA briefers are just not allowed to. That's what we can bring to the table and actually get the care and benefits process started right there in TAP. So the last time they drive out the gate, they've got their health care, they've got their mental health care, they've got their prescriptions and potential economic opportunity benefits ready to go that very first day.
Okay, and that's why I want this to happen. I also want to make sure that there's the appropriate oversight from your organizations because there's been a history of this not going well.
So I can tell you that the VFW in our MOUs with every single base that we are operating on, it's close to maybe 24, that's part of our agreement. We do not recruit on federal property while doing benefits assistance. We have no problem ensuring that that's even further reinforced. We know that our services are done correctly, they're valuable, and if membership comes from that, we'll be happy. But we are not there to recruit, we're there to help people set up claims and benefits.
I get it. I want a friendly face in front of our veterans before they're out of the military. I want a active duty serviceman or woman who's still got shiny shoes on to look at you guys because you're hometown folks. And I do eventually want them to join your organizations and other various organizations because when we sit together as brothers and sisters, we look each other in the eye and we know when someone's having a problem. And that's critical to prevent veteran suicide. So I support you guys. I mean, I didn't borrow these hats, dude. They're mine. My time is expiring here, so thank you very much for coming out here. I appreciate it greatly. And with that, I yield back the Chair now recognizes Mr. Takano for 5 minutes. Ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Takano, for 5 minutes. That's a long title.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a short title. Ms. Smith, your testimony pointed to the need for additional data on military spouse employment, and I couldn't agree more with you. While the Department of Defense conducts a survey every 2 years, it is only a snapshot, and it's not really useful for comparing unemployment over time. So understanding the scope of military spousal employment is important for us to effectively tackle it, which is why I've worked with the Appropriations Committee to push the Department of Defense and Bureau of Labor Statistics to collaborate on better capturing this data. So can you discuss the limitations of the existing data on military spouse employment?
Thank you for the question. So right now, as you stated, the Department of Defense does survey military spouses every 2 years on unemployment rates. That is point-in-time data. That is not data that reflects changes in regions or changes in the time of year, monthly fluctuations, things like that. That would be incredibly helpful information to target solutions for military spouse unemployment. As an example, we don't know if military spouse unemployment is worse in some regions of the country compared to others. We don't know where we may be able to find solutions that are working from one region or one installation of the country that could be scaled out to another installation or region. And without that kind of data, it makes it really hard to target solutions in an effective, efficient manner.
Well, great. So how do these limitations hinder the development of targeted solutions, would you say?
So we know, for example, that there are supportive community members in every defense community around the country. And when they come to support military spouse employment needs, one of the things we see is an inability to communicate exactly what those needs are in certain localized areas. If we were able to more specifically talk about the talent that existed in the community with community support that wanted to help leverage or support it, we would be able to have, I think, a much more productive conversation about solving our unemployment problem.
I see. So can you tell us what kind of authorities the Department of Labor would need to reliably measure military spouse unemployment?
So some of the things that we have studied or kind of gathered information around really more is the appropriate way of phrasing it, is that we do think that there would have to be data sharing agreements between and among different departments in the federal government in order to ensure that, for example, Department of Labor could measure military spouse unemployment. It cannot be measured the same way that other subpopulations are measured simply because Department of Defense is the one that holds that data. So there could be other federal agencies that would need to be engaged to ensure that kind of the number is accurate and able to be reported out in a way that's sensitive to PII information. But we do think that there would probably have to be some sort of information sharing or data sharing authorization to make that happen.
Well, thank you. That concludes my questioning. I yield back the balance of my time.
Okay, with the consent of my ranking member, we will do a second round of questions because we didn't get to get everybody. So I Chair now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Gomez. I've got this other hat here. Okay, I'm getting old. I just want to ask all of you individually. I know that you looked at this legislation. There's a whole bunch of it out there. I want to know if there's any part of any one of these bills that you are concerned about, it goes too far or it doesn't go far enough. And I'm just going to start with you, Mr. Gomez.
Yes, and thank you for the question. The only thing that I would add is for grant per diem, one bill suggested 200% increase, another bill 140, and I believe 133 was the difference. I think something needs to be done fast because veterans are in need of services. Whatever that percentage is, I would just urge Congress to make a decision.
Well, we're working on it, Mr. Gomez. Unfortunately, one word I would not associate with Congress is nimble. Throw that out there. Mr. Schwartzman?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. ROA is a strong supporter of H.R. 3943. This is the USERRA legislation on the docket today that doesn't have to do directly with military spouses. ROA supports the legislation as currently written, but also would support some minor amendments to ensure its enforceability, specifically with Section 2, subsection B, which has to do with the awarding of prejudgment interest rates and then also liquidated damages as well. As a general rule of thumb, although it is subject to a case-by-case basis, ROA would prefer that legislation has strong language such as shall as opposed to may to ensure its enforceability and to ensure that those enforceability standards are pretty close to universal across the board. But again, it is subject to a case-by-case basis. Regarding the awarding of prejudgment interest rates, under the current construct of our federalist system of government, states actually have the capacity to set a mandated prejudgment interest rate. And the way that the legislation is currently written is that it would provide courts with the ability to award a prejudgment interest rate that's lower than what's currently afforded at the state level.
Okay, Mr. Schwartzman, I saw that, but I want you to parse that out and give it to our staff.
Okay, absolutely.
And I tell you, here's how I work. If it makes sense, we will do it. I don't care what, I do not attach any political calculation to any of the decisions made on this subcommittee, none. So if it makes sense, we'll do it.
Absolutely.
Very well. Ma'am, I'm going to skip right over to Mr. Hollinger because he's been sitting here very patiently.
Thank you, sir. So the Enlisted Association is here predominantly to support USERRA for spouses. We believe that there was a contract that was signed with the United States government. It was called I Do. Our spouses, we know that as reserve service members, especially on the enlisted side, that there's 3 avenues that have to be in place for us to be successful. We have to have strong employment, we have to have strong service members, and we have to have strong spouses. And without the combination of those 3 things, and all 3 of them being protected equally, we will not be successful. The National Guard is coming off unprecedented use. Over 380,000 service members have been activated since March of 2020 for everything underneath the sun. We have absolutely become the nation's 911, and we're very proud of that. But to have that ability for us to be the push-button answer, we have to be able to support our spouses at home. They support me at all. My spouse has always supported me. Unfortunately, couldn't be here today. But she has supported me 100%, and I am only as good as she allowed me to be.
Mr. Hollinger, I want you to know I appreciate your comments and your sentiment. I do. As I said, I've had a Navy wife for 30 years now. We just got to find the right way to do it. We have to balance fiscal responsibility with also making sure the civil liberties of individual companies are not violated because they are entities and they're people too. We got to make sure that we don't upset the apple cart with the workforce by creating unintended consequences by trying to do something that's good. But my intent, obviously, is to have a robust military. I had 50 Pennsylvania National Guard guys work for me in Iraq, and I'd take those mugs right now. They were awesome. So I have a tremendous amount of respect for what you guys are doing. I just want to figure out how to do it the right way. That's all. And with that, my time has expired, and I now yield to the Ranking Member Takano for 5 minutes.
Oh, thank you. My question is for Mr. Hollinger. Mr. Hollinger, do you know of any of your members or know of Guard or Reserve who wanted to exercise their USERRA rights when they returned back from their deployments to return to their employment? Because my understanding under USERRA, a guardsman or guardswoman or a reservist, when they are called up for duty, they have a right to return back to employment. Their employer is supposed to keep their job open. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, yes, sir. I believe you're asking me, have we seen problems with guardsmen returning home and having problems with their job or getting their jobs back?
Yes.
Absolutely. I think Mr. Diaz spoke about that earlier, where he, resolved over 1,000 cases, and I think there's even more through state and federal governments. I think we hear about USERRA problems more than I hear about any other problem on my legislative portfolio.
USERRA with respect to gaining access, getting employment back when they
Roger.
return.
Roger.
It is their right under the law, right, under USERRA.
Yes, sir.
So can you tell me what we need to do in order to make sure that our service members come back and they get the jobs that they should have the right to under law?
I think education. I think all of us that are sitting here on the panel are just as responsible for that as anybody else. We need to educate our employers, educate our employees and our service members so that they don't make small mistakes that cause big issues. I think almost every single time that I've been involved in a USERRA case, it's somebody that had a misinterpretation of the law and believed that they were doing the right thing. I think employers tend to violate due to just fatigue. I think.
Have you ever run into situations where a forced arbitration clause in an employment contract hindered an ability of a service member to be able to exercise their USERRA rights? Is that an issue?
Well, yes, sir. That happens constantly. We have. I can share many cases. I prefer not to put names out in public.
You don't need to put names out, but I think it's important for this committee and for members to know, and the public to know, that this is a real problem.
Well, sir, I agree that it's absolutely a real problem. We recognized that problem when it came to sexual assault and sexual harassment cases, and we got rid of the forced arbitration in there. Forced arbitration, you're asking somebody that gets paid by a company to rule against who's feeding them dinner. I know I'm smart enough not to do that very often.
So it doesn't seem right to me that somebody who has been deployed, and maybe many times, and I've seen what our Guard and our Reserve do, and the chairman has, has his own testimony here about what they have done on deployment. They come back and they try to get their job back, but they can't go to court because of in order to enforce their right, they should be able to go to court and get a judge to say, well, USERRA says you have a right to your job back. Your company should have held that job open for you. I actually did that as the chairman. When I was chairman of this committee, when my staff director went off to Syria for several months, we all knew we should have known, and we did know that we had to keep that position open. We had 2 people go off, right? So, but there are companies the companies, instead of welcoming that service member back, they use their legal right in an employment contract, and because that employment contract has a forced arbitration clause, that it goes to arbitration instead of the court. And as you said, the arbitrator is often slanted toward the employer. I think it's high time that Congress address this issue, because I think it is a travesty that we treat our service members this way.
I had one more thing to point out on that. I think that forced arbitration is one of the very few spots in law that allows you to waive your rights. That and the 517 waiver, that's a totally different topic. But there's very few instances as an employee that you're allowed to waive your employment rights, and this just happens to be one of them. And I think we're always going to see negative impact from it.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you all for attending this hearing. And I appreciate the discussion today and your written testimony. Again, I've read it in its totality about how to improve several of the bills. We've got to continue to work together to solve these issues for the veterans and service members, the issues that they face today. However, we have to do this in a fiscally responsible way. And as my colleagues on both sides of the aisle understand, we have very limited offsets because we're under the pay-go system. and we've got to find ways to reduce the cost of bills while delivering the original intent of the bill. I want that to be exceptionally clear with everyone. We are here to serve you. I look forward to working with ranking members both Levin and Takano, and the rest of the folks on this committee to get that done, serving you. With that, I yield to the ranking member Takano for any concluding remarks you may have, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Van Orden, and I don't have any further comments, and I yield back.
Thank you, ranking member Takano. Again, thank you very much for your participation in today's hearing, and I've received a number of statements for the record, which will be submitted into the record as long as they meet submission requirements. I ask for unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous, thank you, put the enlisted guy in charge, extraneous materials without objection, so ordered. This hearing is adjourned. Hey.